Okay, so I made a quick video on predestination, and I wanted to go over some verses because I don't see many discussing this subject, predestination, and I just basically gathered as many verses as I could on the matter, verses that are um, helpful, and some may be harder to understand than others. But anyways, yeah, so I wanted to discuss this subject, and we're going to take a look at a few verses throughout the Canon Bible that reference some individuals as being predestined. And let's begin with Jeremiah chapter 1 and verse 5. It says, "Before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee, and before thou camest forth out of the womb, I sanctified thee, and I ordained thee a prophet unto the nations." So here God is telling Jeremiah that before he formed him in his mother's belly, he knew him. And before he came forth out of his mother's womb, he had already sanctified him and ordained him to be a prophet unto the nations. So what does this mean? What can God possibly be talking about in this verse here? Obviously, it seems that Jeremiah was very much predestined to be a prophet, and not just by some random act that God decided to do, but because he knew him, you know? It says he knew him. He knew him before he formed him in the belly, you know? And before he came forth out of his mother's womb, he had already been chosen to be a prophet. So I guess you could consider Jeremiah a type of elect. He was an elect in the sense that he was already predestined to be a prophet, and he was foreknown by God. He wasn't just some kind of random act, like I said, that God placed upon Jeremiah to be a prophet out of some random, choosing. And you got to take it for what is being mentioned here. It says he knew him, and that means he knew him. That could also make sense to the reason why he chose him to be a prophet, because he already knew him before. And it says before he was even formed. So what does that mean? That means that he had a prior existence. Let's look at our next verse. And as we start going down through all these verses, hopefully it will make sense, a lot more sense than it is now. But it makes sense. I mean, Jeremiah 1:5, it doesn't get any more clear than that. That's why I put it as my opening verse. Romans 8:29, it says, for whom he did foreknow, meaning those like Jeremiah that he foreknew. At what age? We don't know. Well, I don't know anyways. But he says that for whom he did foreknow, he also did predestinate. Like Jeremiah. We keep going back to that verse that we just read. Those he already knew before they came into this present earth age, this age in the flesh, the material age that nothing lasts. Those he knew, he had already predestined, determined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that is Christ, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. Romans 8:29, it says, and those whom he predestined, he also called. Like Jeremiah, he was predestined to be a prophet, so he called them. So he's an elect. And those whom he called, he also justified. And those whom he justified, he also glorified. He redeemed. Because we know this earth is very dirty. And everyone that comes through this earth needs to be cleansed in some form or another. And let's read Romans 9:23. It says, what if he did this to make the riches of his glory known to the objects of his mercy, whom he prepared in advance for glory. Objects of his mercy, he's referring to his elect. It says here, whom he had prepared in advance. In advance, meaning before everything had taken place. Like I said, in their lives, whom he had prepared in advance for his glory. So he's not just doing these random acts, not just random acts of grace, but there's some actual individuals, like Jeremiah, for example, that he already knew them, and he already knew what they were going to be destined to be in this age of the flesh through their lifetime here on this earth, the temporal earth that we are living in now. So don't confuse the predestined elect. Like, for example, prophets like Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, from Adam, going all the way from the book of Genesis, the prophets there all the way until the end of Revelation. All those prophets could be considered elect, predestined. You know, if not all of them, for sure a good majority of them. And sure, there might be some that he also elected, during their time here on this earth. He called them, but you could almost bank on it that if they have some type of word that they were destined to preach on this earth, and that you could find within the Bible or in all the side apocryphals and all the other books that they've been trying to keep from us, you could rest assured that it's more likely than not that they were predestined, more than just randomly chosen, as some kind of gracious act by God. Although he does do that, a lot of these prophets were just predetermined and predestined because he already knew them. As it says here, he prepared in advance for glory. So he could trust these individuals. I'm not saying that they were perfect and saints, but I'm saying they had a position, they had a destiny before they ever came into the flesh. That's why he told Jeremiah that he knew him before he formed him in his mother's womb. And before he came out of his mother's womb, he already was destined to be a prophet. Ephesians 1:4, it says, according as he had chosen us, the elect, in him before the foundation of the world. Do you see that? Before the foundation of the world. When was that? Before the world was laid and rebuilt or constructed. So now Jeremiah 1:5 makes a lot more sense. According as he had chosen us in him before the foundation of the world. Predestination, ring a bell? Then it says that we should be holy and without blame before him in love. Next verse, Ephesians 1:5, it says, having predestined us, this is select, unto the adoption of children by Jesus Christ to himself. So this is the adoption of Gentiles, I guess, the elect Gentiles, or what have you. Because remember, some of these epistles were written by Paul to preach unto the Gentiles. So you have the elect, actual Israel, and you have the spiritual Israel, whom is speaking about as being adopted children, because they are spiritual children, which is the end product. If you're not spiritually in obedience with Christ, transformed into his likeness, that attitude that you should have, whether you're considered Israelite by the flesh, the end product is to be adopted and changed into spiritually being conformed into the likeness of Christ. So it says here, having predestined us unto the adoption of children by Jesus Christ to himself. Sounds like the Gentiles adopted children. Jesus Christ himself, according to the good pleasure of his will. So you have the elect, actual physical descendants of Israel, and you have the elect Gentiles, not to be confused one with the other. But what we both have in common is that we both are in Jesus Christ. If we are not under him and not being transformed into his likeness, then we are none of his. Next verse, Ephesians 1:11. It says, "Furthermore, because we are united with Christ, we have received an inheritance from God." See that? We get our inheritance from God because we are united with his Son. For he chose us in advance. God chose us in advance. Hence the verse from Jeremiah 1:5 again. He foreknew those he chose. There is some special chosen that have a destiny here on this earth throughout all the generations since the foundations of this earth. Since the rebuilding of this earth, as mentioned in Genesis chapter 1, since that time, each person that was born, or some of them, now I'm not going to say all of them, we all have different callings, but in each generation there was always an elect, ever since the beginning of time towards the end of this present material age, this second world age. There's always been elects being born throughout each generation.